After turning 34 this year, Jack sometimes feels this is none other than hell. If only he had learnt the sword a little earlier. Then, he could have stopped his older sister from being sent to the Empire. He wonders if the monster that he is would still exist if that had happened. He also thinks if he could have met his master if that had happened. His master had changed him, who could do nothing, and taught him many things. The moments he'd had with his master were the best in his life, and she was his savior and much more. He thinks how he would have treated his master better if he knew he'd regret it like this. Sitting in exhaustion, he thinks this isn't what he desired at all. A guy appears with a sword. Jack notices the sword in his hand shake. He wonders if the boy can really swing it around in that state. Jack then says that he let the children be as much as he could, and yet this was how he repays him. The guy says Jack killed his father, and Jack emotionlessly says that it's regrettable. The boy calls him a monster. Jack has been called that 1,000 times, so it's not new to him. However, he felt pain all over his body. His brain felt like it would melt and constantly sent him signals to end everything. But he pushes himself to wait a little more. Jack says to the boy that he's the one who killed all the masters, destroyed the Tulkun Empire by himself, killed the Emperor, and completely ended the Imperial line. He says he's killed more than tens of thousands, and the boy still chose to call him a monster because that's obvious. At this point, the boy with the sword trembles in fear. Jack asks the kid what his name is. Jack Stewart is the reply. Jack is startled upon hearing this and says it's a coincidence as his name is Jack too. He wonders if he actually killed his father. He says he's killed so many people that he doesn't even remember someone named Stewart. Jack Stewart says that although he wasn't a good father, he was a father he needed. Hearing this, Jack sighs in envy. He says he wouldn't apologize for killing him, but he would give him a chance. He then asks Jack Stewart to pierce him with the sword he's holding, causing him to sweat in fear. Jack tells him it's the perfect opportunity to avenge his father and to be worshipped as the hero who killed the monster. Jack thinks how he could come out of this alive if he put his mind to it. He could even heal his broken leg and restore the damaged organs. But he didn't want to. Jack Stewart hesitantly raises the sword and prepares to stab him. But just as he's about to, he gives up and drops to his knees. Reaching out with his hand, Jack pats Jack Stewart on the head and says well done. He asks him if he would have been able to live peacefully after killing him. He also says that being a hero would have been exhausting and he'd have many names bestowed upon him. He tells him to not live and regret like him as he's still young. Jack Stewart sheds tears and sobs, and Jack thinks that his resolve is weakening. He asks Jack Stewart to tell the others that the demon is dead and the war is over. While crying, Jack Stewart asks why he lives like this when he has so much power. To this, Jack says who knows why he lives like this and falls on his side, thinking this is the end. He can feel it as there's loss of sensation in his fingers and his sight is becoming blurry, and even though he doesn't want them to, his eyes are closing. The moment he forgot to breathe, all the sounds around him stopped, and at that last moment, he had a thought that if everything were to start from the beginning again, it could be possible to change this pitiful ending. Jack felt like he was dreaming. He remembers everything from the father he doubted if they were biologically related, his mother who died when he was born, his older sister whose beauty was known across the continent, and even the second-born who bullied him constantly. After giving up the name Jack Valantier, he became the sword ghost who traversed the continent, and the events that happened flashed through his mind. He was confused whether it was a dream or reality. In the Second Continental War that he started, he was the victor and the monster of monsters. While running towards revenge, he had destroyed the Tulkun Empire and killed all who carried the name of the Tulkun. He'd always won and was happy that he achieved his goals, so he willingly accepted death because he no longer had a reason to live. Jack stands in front of a mirror, puzzled as to what this situation is. It doesn't seem to be black magic or an illusion. He wonders if he really came back to the past. He cannot believe this is possible. The Marquis house was a renowned family in the Teslan kingdom. This family belonged to the loyalist faction that supported the king, and Jack was the youngest child of the family. As long as he didn't get greedy for the title of heir, the position he had was enough to live comfortably for his entire life. This was common knowledge, but the Marquis house was an exception. Jack walks through the rose garden, admiring the flowers. Although this garden looked beautiful on the outside, it was just an illusion. This place was known as exile. Its sole purpose is to shut off the youngest who has no houses supporting him, completely from the outside world. Jack's butler, Ron, shows up with a drink for him. Ron was the only one in the estate that cared about him. Jack jokingly asks Ron if he put any poison in it. Ron sweats profusely while asking why he would do so. Jack laughs and says that he was joking and thanks Ron. Ron says it's nothing and leaves. There are 11 people in the rose garden, excluding Jack. One of them is Ron and the other 10 are soldiers who keep an eye on Jack. Jack is sure now that this is reality. He didn't know he would regress, so there's nothing he has planned. He's currently 14 and he has no calluses on his hands. He doesn't even have a mana heart. If he compared himself to other children from noble families, he was really inadequate. But there's a reason for that. His thought process is cut off by someone who smacks him from behind, making him drop the drink. Jack thinks he's been careless and it's been so many years since he got hit in the head. He looks behind to see his older brother, Phelan, who yells at him and says that his older brother is here and he hasn't even greeted him. Phelan's 3 years older than Jack and the second child. The reason why Jack couldn't do mana training was because of Phelan's threats and abuses. Jack faces Phelan, thinking how even after decades have passed, Phelan's abuses still linger in his mind. He had called him a lowlife and said that he could kill him if he wanted to, and said that unlike their sister, Jack was useless. Phelan had also told him to not learn sword techniques or magic, because the moment he learns it, Phelan would take it that Jack betrayed him and he would kill him. He had also said that as long as Jack stayed in this house, he would only be allowed to eat and wear what he was given. He says if he lived like a dead rat, Phelan would become Marquis, and then think of Jack as his younger brother. Jack was very weak-kneed when he was young. Because of this, he was called the shame of the household. But outside, it was even worse. Jack was a laughingstock and even the commoners mocked him. The only family member that Jack could rely on and the only one who cared about him was the firstborn, his biological sister who was a year older than Phelan. She couldn't become a successor of the family because she's a woman. She was a beautiful child and her fate was already decided from the start. She would get into an arranged marriage with a family their father liked, and live trapped in a mansion and carry on the family line. Phelan was the person who wanted to make use of her the most. He went around asking the playboys of Duke families if they wanted to bed his sister. With eyes of intent, Jack stares at Phelan and thinks that he deserves to be killed. Noticing this, Phelan aims to punch Jack for staring at him, but his arm is caught by Jack. Phelan gets angry and calls Jack a bastard for doing so. Jack then flips Phelan and slams him to the ground. Phelan says Jack is a lowlife for not knowing his place. Jack notes that Phelan seems to be gathering mana. The soldiers watching contemplate if they should interfere or leave them be. Phelan prepares to grab his sword to attack but is stopped by Ron, who steps in between them. Ron asks Phelan to hold it in and not use mana in such situations. Phelan hits Ron, causing him to fall. But Jack isn't worried about this as Ron is a man of secrets. Phelan threatens to kill both Jack and Ron. So, Jack says he's very talkative and asks if he fights with his mouth. Phelan takes out his sword, which Jack thought was an ornamental one. Jack has neither trained nor does he have an ounce of mana, but he's still confident he won't lose. Phelan's power was at the third circle. Even if he used mana and an expensive sword, a kid is a kid. And Phelan's techniques were clumsy. Jack wonders if he should just throw Phelan, but then says that he needs to be educated a little. Fundamentally, when one fills their body with mana using the mana utilization method, they should include their head as well. So Jack smacks Phelan in the face, while thinking that it'd only be fair if he returned at least 1/100th of the humiliation he's given him. After Jack's assault, Phelan is on the floor, motionless. Jack kicks him with his foot asking if he's dead. Seeing this, the soldiers head towards Jack. Jack orders them to stop and not move unless they wanted to become like Phelan too. He then grabs Phelan by the hair and drags him across the garden, while saying that he needs to lose weight as he's heavy. When he reaches a trough of water, he tells Phelan that the weather's sweltering today so his kind brother would cool his head for him. He dunks his head into the water and thinks about the things that happened because of Phelan. After his sister was married off to the Empire, Phelan assassinated their father, the Marquis, with poison. After that, Phelan became the Marquis and committed all kinds of atrocities as if he had the Empire on his side. The Valantier Marquis house disappeared because of not being able to fulfill anything. Jack has no intention of avenging his father or the house. What he's mad about is how he wasted the chance made by his sister's sacrifice. His sister was a smart woman with a refined nature. Jack can't even begin to understand how she felt when she headed to the Empire. She'd gone to the Empire solely for the glory of the house. She was aware of her circumstances as the man who she married was the Imperial Prince who was rumored to commit all kinds of disgusting acts. He had told her that no one would even come to see her as she's not the legal wife. He tells her all she has to do is keep her head down, nod and smile. For her family, his sister endured all kinds of mistreatment. Jack wonders what would happen if Phelan and their dad found out how his sister ended up. He tells himself to stop thinking about it or he would die from anger. Jack then hears Phelan muttering and stammering to spare him. Phelan pleads with him and Jack thinks that he's quite familiar with this appearance. He had seen it too many times in his past life. It was the expression of those engulfed in the fear of death. Jack asks Phelan to carefully think about the things he had done until now. He then says that Phelan probably doesn't even remember and ponders what he should do to make him remember. Jack then answers himself and says that if Phelan experienced it directly, he'd be able to understand the value of family. Jack raises his hand to punch Phelan, who immediately says he was wrong and asks Jack to stop this. Ron shows up and asks Jack to stop too, and hearing this, Jack lets go of Phelan. He then calls a soldier and asks him to take care of this while kicking Phelan. He says he's not dead yet and asks him to take Phelan away. Ron asks Jack if he's okay, but he just brushes past him and walks away without saying anything. The words of Jack's action had spread across the house in an instant, and the house was flipped on its head. Phelan Valantier is Jack's half-brother as well as the future heir of the household. With his maternal family, the Mantis Count family, backing him, Phelan was the one who'd become the next Marquis, but he was lying in bed with his head split open. He'd also developed a fear of water, so the entire house was flipped on its head. Meanwhile, Jack is in his room enjoying dessert. There were tons of rumors. Phelan was a genius who shouldered the house's expectations. He was someone who'd reached the third circle at the age of 17. So people wondered how the youngest beat him. The youngest didn't learn magic or martial arts. They discuss if Jack's been hiding his true strength, and if he did, why was he revealing his strength now? Phelan turns 18 next year. He was planned to be named the official heir after his coming-of-age ceremony. So people talked that maybe the youngest coveted his position. Their sister, Elizabeth, shows up and asks what the commotion is about. After a while, the rumors started to swell and people within the Marquis house wondered how the Lord would react to this. The Marquis orders for the third child to be brought to him. Jack compliments Ron that the cake is delicious. He thanks Jack and a girl shows up and whispers something to Ron. Ron then lets Jack know that the Lord has summoned him to the main building. Jack gets up immediately and Ron says he would accompany him. Jack says it's fine as he is not a baby. So Ron says he understands and asks him to take care. Jack enters the main building and all eyes are on him. He thinks how it's been a while since he was ignored like this. Jack couldn't care less about how people saw him, but he hopes this ends soon. Two knights stand by the door, treating Jack as if he's invisible. So he tries to kick them while asking if they can't hear or see him. If it was Jack's past self, he would have walked away after seeing their expression. But not this time. Jack asks him to stop making that face or else he would fold his body in two. The knight asks him to pardon him and Jack proceeds to kick him in the leg, making him fall down. He then asks the knight why he won't let him go in when the Lord has summoned him. The knight says he won't tell him that. Jack then says that the knight must mean for him to wait. In his mind, he knows the knight must be thinking that he's not worthy of being here, so he won't let him inside. He walks away thinking this man hasn't changed a single bit. The knight sees this and asks where he's going. Jack asks him to tell the Lord to come see him if he has something to say. The knights think that Jack has finally gone mad. The Lord is informed that Jack has left. Hearing this, he says the youngest has changed a lot. Jack sits in the rose garden, while thinking that the Lord would be coming to see him soon. Just then, footsteps approach. The Lord arrives with his maids and a few others. Jack notices how his face looks stubborn as hell. He can't help but laugh since he hasn't changed a bit from what he remembers. Jack thinks of his father as non-existent. He had tried to kill Jack when he ran away from home in his past life. He also gave away his child to a ruffian for power. He was greedy for power beyond his grasp and lacked the ability to realize his ambitions. Jack could never call someone like that his father. He casually asks the Lord what brings him here. The Lord asks Jack why he did it. Jack asks him what he did and his second mother yells at him, asking him how he dares to show disrespect to the Lord. Jack then says to the Lord that he's come a long way, so they should head inside unless he plans on talking here. Saying this, he tosses the plate away while the people watch in shock. It shatters into pieces and Jack notices the Lord checking if he secretly made a mana heart. Then, the Lord says that Jack doesn't have a mana heart. He says Jack seems to have a talent for martial arts. He asks him why he hasn't revealed it until now. In his mind, Jack thinks that he wouldn't believe him if he told him he regressed. Jack simply says, just because. Angrily, the woman yells at him and calls him an impatient brat and commoner's child. The Lord says that he thought Jack was useless, but now he sees that he has some use. Jack angrily asks if wouldn't be his child if he was useless. The Lord asks if he wants to be acknowledged as his child. Jack says after all this time, he's not the least bit interested. People gasp in horror and the Lord turns and walks away while saying that he has heard Jack. Jack is confused over how he left without being angry. He then wonders why he came in the first place. He then calls out to the Marchioness and says that her wrinkles have gotten worse and that she should take better care of her appearance. Jack thinks how seeing her face like that makes him happy. He then bids them good evening and sends his regards to Phelan. Later, Ron is reading out a letter to Phelan. It states that Jack Valantier has been sentenced to 20 days of solitary confinement for making commotion in the house. After reading it, Ron asks what on earth happened by the time he got to the main building. Jack says these things can happen and asks him to stop making such a fuss. He tells Ron that he always ignored when Phelan pummeled him, but Jack is the one to get solitary confinement. While drawing roses, Jack thinks about how he is already exiled in the rose garden and wonders how he could get solitary confinement on top of that. Ron says that there's only a month of his academy vacation left. This startles Jack as he had completely forgotten about it. Jack was 14 years old and attending the kingdom's academy. All noble children of the Teslan kingdom must attend this academy. The official duration of the academy was 4 years. Jack was in his first year now. It's currently summer vacation after the end of the first semester. Jack reminisces about his master, who's very closely related to the academy. Even if he skipped over everything else, Master is the one thing he couldn't skip over. He couldn't afford to waste him time arguing with the Marquis, so he decides that he should go to the academy. There's 27 days left of the vacation and 20 days of solitary confinement. It took about 6 days to get to the academy from where Jack was. So basically, the Lord was telling him to screw off to the academy after he came out of solitary confinement. When Jack is done with his art, he asks Ron where the solitary confinement room is. Ron doesn't reply, so Jack asks again. Ron says that there's only one place that could be called a solitary confinement room in this house: the accommodation for criminals who have committed a crime within the territory. Jack is bewildered that he's going to prison. Truthfully, for the children of the noble families, the academy vacation was not a break but an extension of something else. During the vacation, Phelan attended social parties every day before his head was split open. He met the vassals while acquainting himself with other nobles. However, Jack had no such opportunity. He never had any interest in the Marquis position in the first place. People in the Marquis house had told him that he has no place in this house. Jack had voluntarily headed to the prison before the knights came for him. Ron had shed tears while watching him. Ron told him to take care and Jack wanted to leave as he was getting embarrassed. In his prison cell, Jack has a toilet and a bed and he even gets 3 meals a day. So Jack thinks that the Lord must have some consideration for him, but however, the blanket looked like it hadn't been washed in 500 years and the food tasted bad. Jack had spent the whole day thinking in solitary confinement, but this was too much. Nobles who own a territory can punish people within that territory with territorial laws that they've created on top of kingdom laws. In other words, vassals had the same power as a king in their own territory. Though the Lord had confined him to the prison as if he had abandoned him, Jack feels like he should still be his son. Jack didn't try to instigate a rebellion, but the Lord chose to imprison his own son. Jack wonders how the Lord would cover this incident for his beloved Phelan. He wonders if he'd announce that Jack used poison or a forbidden artifact. He then thinks that it's trivial, and that he'd probably cook up something like how Jack learnt black magic due to his own greed, and the second-born discovered this and tried to rectify his little brother, but instead of listening to him, Jack attacked him using black magic. And he would conclude by saying that even though Phelan had a wound on his head, he still forgave his little brother after all that. Jack is sure that a gut-wrenching scenario like this is in the Marquis and Marchioness's heads. He feels sick just thinking about them. Jack wonders if he should just leave after a day or two. He doesn't want to waste his precious vacation in this disgusting prison. Jack wants to leave this estate as soon as possible, but he has 3 things on his mind: his sister, Ron, and the master. And besides all that, he was currently a weakling. He was 168 centimeters tall and weighed 55 kilograms and had no muscles. To Jack, this world was dictated by one thing: survival of the fittest. Only the strong survive and the weak don't even amount to fertilizer. Jack has no plans to commit a massacre like he did in his past life, but there were things he needed to do. There's more people to take revenge on than he expected. Right now, he needed 2 things: time and power. The academy would solve both those things. He could buy time as he discovered talents to increase his power, and he'd naturally regain the power he had in his past life. Jack really wishes to regain his power so he could protect his sister, Ron, and his master. And then, though he doesn't like it, he'd take what he needs. A mana user is divided into 10 ranks. 1st to 3rd circle users are beginners. 4th to 6th circle users are experts, and 7th to 9th circle users are called high circle mana users, and those of the 10th circle are called masters. They're also called superhumans. Holding his hands near his heart, Jack makes mana circles. He's glad that he's in a place away from prying eyes. It takes him only 2 hours to make 1 mana circle. He thinks youth sure is nice and wonders if it's because he started mana training at 17 years old in the past. While he's training his mana, he thinks he can't let this be revealed yet. He then hears footsteps and wonders if it's the Marchioness, but then realizes the sound is too light. He pretends to sleep on the bed until he hears a voice call him as Jackie. He immediately shoots up. It was a person he could only see in his dreams and meet in his past memories. His sister, Elizabeth. She worriedly asks him if he's hurt. Teary-eyed, he looks up at his kind sister. Elizabeth calls him Jackie again and Jack is astonished. It's a nickname he hasn't heard in ages. He tells her he's not hurt at all and that he's completely fine. She asks him why he used magic after she'd told him she'd teach him magic anytime. Jack apologizes and Elizabeth says he should have stayed at the academy longer and asks him why he came to the house. Jack doesn't reply and cries happy tears. She then worriedly asks him if he's listening to her and if he's actually hurt somewhere. Jack says he's just so glad that this is real. He then asks her if they should both run away. He says they could go somewhere in the forests where nomads live and start a farm together. Jack says he's aware of how the Marchioness and Phelan treat her, so it's better to abandon it all and live somewhere peacefully. He also adds that they could find someone for her who would treat her right. He then talks about how they'd be free from the Marquis if they ran away, until he's cut off by Elizabeth shouting out his name. She asks him not to talk that way as the Marquis is their father. She says that no matter what, he was their father and he loved their mother. She then says that she knows his father hates him, but she would try to change his opinion of Jack. Asking him to endure it a little longer, she asks Jack if he trusts her. Jack feels like he's heard this in the past and wonders if he really returned to the past. Without responding to her question, Jack reaches for her hands and says he's glad to see her after so long. Then, Elizabeth adoringly says that he's such a baby. Jack then asks her to back up a little. She does so in puzzlement, and using mana powers, Jack breaks the lock open. Elizabeth is beyond surprised at this and asks Jack when and how he made a mana circle. Jack just rushes to hug her and apologizes to her. She pulls him away and asks if he ate anything weird. She asks him again if he's really okay. Overcome by his feelings, Jack says yes and hugs her again, while saying that it'll be different this time and that a lot of things are gonna change. He also says she doesn't have to be the one to make sacrifices every time. From this point on, was the truth Jack found from interrogating the Imperial Prince who took his sister away in his past life. That truth was even more wretched than he thought. It also turned Jack into a monster. It was the worst future of his sister unbeknownst to the world. That only he knew. Using a weapon, Jack had tortured and beat up the Imperial Prince for what he did to his sister and said that he'd never forgive the Tulkun Imperial family. 10 years after Jack had left home at the age of 17, many things changed in the world. The Teslan kingdom disappeared and the Valantyr house was destroyed. Tulkun became the greatest empire in the western continent, and the Valantyr house survived for a short time. Elizabeth was the wife of the Tulkun Empire's prince at the time, and she had begged him to spare her family and let them out of prison. His sister was not even a legal wife, so the prince pushed her and ignored her plea. However, Elizabeth still never gave up. She begged them in the rain for 3 days and 3 nights, asking them to grant her family mercy. After seeing her commendable efforts, the emperor and the imperial prince listened to her plea. That was the first story Jack had heard. It was the most beautiful story to spread across the continent at the time. However, from this point on, was the worst future Jack knew of. Elizabeth had thanked the imperial prince for his mercy, but the prince, slamming his hand on the wall behind her, says that she seems to be misunderstanding, as he could destroy something like her house anytime he wanted, unless she listened to what he says. So, Elizabeth became the 4th imperial prince's toy, and 3rd imperial prince at the time, or the current crown prince, used her as a slave. In that situation, the legal wives of the imperial prince were envious and didn't stand by idly. What happened after that was the imperial prince got bored of Elizabeth and abandoned her, and she was imprisoned in an outhouse by the legal wives. It was around that time the Valantyr Marquis house was destroyed. After Jack had heard that story, he turned into a monster. He annihilated everything that had the name Tulkun or anything that even had the slightest connection to the Tulkun. He killed the Empress, the Imperial Princess, the 3rd Imperial Prince's wife, and the 4th Imperial Prince's wife. Jack even destroyed families that were connected to them, to eliminate even the slightest trace that they existed in this world. Still holding onto Elizabeth's hands, Jack thinks that's too wretched of a future. Elizabeth tells him to take care of himself and that she would put in a good word to their father. Jack asks her not to worry and she leaves, while thinking how the youngest has changed, as he used to be someone who did nothing but avoid and hide. She then wonders how he used black magic when a 6th circle user like her couldn't even sense a trace of black magic. So there's no way their father, who's a 7th circle user, wouldn't know that. so she assumes it could be the Marchioness's influence. Elizabeth then goes to the Lord, their father, and asks him to let Jack out of prison. He asks her why, and she says Jack didn't learn black magic. Black magic is only passed down through legends, so there's no way such a young child who knows nothing could do it. She realizes that the actual reason must be something that the Lord didn't want to reveal to the public. She continues to explain to him that Jack has no interest in the Marquis position. The Lord asks her to continue, and after pausing for a while, she says that this must be his warning to her. The Lord says she's smart. Elizabeth was a tool that serves to raise the status of the Marquis house. Because she was intelligent, she quickly figured out her own fate. This was a warning toward her of what will happen to Jack if she does something stupid. The Lord says that the youngest is not fit for the house. He says that when Jack becomes of age, he'd be officially considered dead to him, and he plans on letting him live his normally somewhere while hiding his identity. Elizabeth asks if this is true. The Lord replies it is, and that she should not forget her duties until then. She asks him not to worry about that, and the Lord says how strange it is for the circless youngest to defeat Phelan. Elizabeth is surprised at hearing that the youngest doesn't have a circle, so she wonders what she saw earlier when Jack broke the lock. The Lord then says that it doesn't matter anymore, so he would let Jack out on Elizabeth's request. She thanks him and leaves the room and thinks about what Jack had said about them running away together. Elizabeth sinks to the floor and cries, thinking there's no way to run because her future has already been decided. Jack wakes up the next morning, feeling like he dreamed of his past life after seeing Elizabeth the previous night. He thinks that maybe it's because he's sleeping somewhere different. Suddenly, a soldier shows up and lets Jack know that he's been released. However, as someone that's dominated the world, Jack knows that he can't be narrow-minded, so he tells the guard that it's unfortunate since his prison room was cozy. He then tries to grab his clothes and shoes from the guard, but the guard doesn't let go of it. Jack knows he's quite disrespected in the house, but this is surprising to him. He thinks how a mere soldier is blatantly showing disrespect to a Marquis house's young lord. The soldier then says that Jack should just go if he doesn't have shoes and asks him to stop annoying him. Jack furiously asks him if he thinks he's his buddy to be able to talk to him that way. And before he knows it, the soldier is attacked by Jack. Jack returns to the rose garden and Ron is waiting for him. He worriedly asks him if he's been hurt. Jack assures him he's fine and asks him to calm down. Then, Ron spots some bloodstains on Jack's outfit and freaks out, asking what happened. Jack calms his down by saying it's not his stains. Jack then notices that there are more soldiers in the garden now. Ron says that 10-foot soldiers and 1 page from the Iron Blood Knight Order has been assigned to them. Jack sees a soldier and asks Ron if he's the page from the Knight Order. Ron says yes, and Jack feels pity for the page. Jack thinks that the page must have had dreams and plans to become a knight, but instead, he's here having to take care of Jack. So, Jack feels bad for him. As he walks towards Jack, Jack assumes that he must have heard what happened in the prison. The page bows to Jack and requests him to tell him what happened in prison if it's not too much. Jack is taken aback as he didn't expect him to be so polite. He tells Jack that he heard that Jack took a guard's right eye in his fingers. Ron tells the page that there's no way the master did such a thing. The page replies that he still has the right to know why he did such a thing. Jack then calls him a son of a bitch. The page asks Jack what he just said, and the reply is that it's not accurate for him to use the words such as rights in a situation like this. Jack studies the page, and judging by his body movements, sensitivity to mana and position of his feet, and Jack notes that he's a 4th circle mana user. Jack then says to him that a dog should know its place. The page says that his words are too harsh, and Jack asks him what's harsh about calling a dog a dog. Jack then makes it clear to the page that he's only here to take care of him and not talk about shit like rights to him. Jack then asks him whether he wants to become an official knight. Hearing this, the page shakingly says that Jack must have been given a mission to observe him, but he keeps messing up. And Jack says that he should be begging him not to make a mess. Hearing this, the guard apologizes. Jack says it's good that this dog at least knows how to think. He then walks away before saying that he's too lazy to keep talking and that the page should settle this matter on his own and report to him later and complain to the Marquis if he has any complaints. He then says that he's too lazy to even call him a page, so he'd just call him Chick from now, and orders him to come running anytime he calls him. Jack walks away with Ron, leaving the page feeling embarrassed. Jack tells Ron he's craving meat today, and Ron immediately acknowledges and says he'd prepare some. Soon, Jack enjoys the meal made by Ron, and he compliments Ron by saying that his cooking skills are top-notch, as expected. Ron says he's flattered and continues to stare at Jack. Noticing this, Jack asks Ron to just say it if he wants to say something and stop gaping at him. Ron looks away, saying it's nothing. Jack then offers Ron a piece of meat and says they can eat together as there's plenty of food. Jack asks Ron if he's hungry and Ron says that he couldn't dare to share a meal with him. Jack orders Ron to sit down and says he has something to tell him too. Ron hesitantly sits down and Jack asks how his sister is doing. Ron says that Lady Elizabeth is as usual. Jack then asks Ron if he's an idiot as he should know how much Elizabeth is suffering. Ron says he doesn't know what he's talking about while Jack continues to eat. He mentions again that Ron's cooking skills are good. Jack tells him about his younger days. The only reason he could enjoy his meals without a care in the world was because Ron always checked whether any of the ingredients were poisoned or not. Ron is surprised that Jack knew that much. Jack says that's not the only thing because he also knows that Ron is a 9th circle mage right now, leaving Ron speechless. Jack then says that Ron was someone who was by his mother's side so Ron would know, but Jack didn't know anything about her, but people tell him she resembles his sister so he assumes she must have been a good person. Ron keeps quiet and Jack asks if Ron protected his mother from the sidelines. Jack then says that if this was a novel, he would have thrown away the book, complaining about the realism, but it actually happened. When Jack ran away from the Marquis house in his past life, Jack wasn't alone. He'd left with Ron while being chased by the pursuers sent by the Lord. The pursuers were members of the Iron Blood Knight Order just like Chick, who he met earlier. So the Marquis had sent pursuers to kill his own son. The captain of the Knight Order at the time was a 9th circle swordsman and Ron had sacrificed himself to protect Jack. Jack tells Ron that he was afraid of him after figuring out he was a 9th circle who used to be his mother's guardian. Jack says that the Marquis didn't know that his mother was a commoner. He also says that she probably didn't even tell Ron, but he would just keep on living without knowing since what kind of person he is would be all that mattered to him. Not making sense of it, Ron asks Jack what he wants from him. Jack tells him that he doesn't trust anyone other than him and Elizabeth, so he asks him to protect Elizabeth. Elizabeth was someone who reached the 6th circle at the age of 18. So even if Jack didn't protect her, she was completely capable of protecting herself. Jack says that she is very kind and sacrificing herself is nothing to her, but that's not how she should be living. Sacrificing for the family and the house was how the Marquis should be living. Jack tells Ron he is planning to go to the academy tomorrow and won't be returning unless it's something serious. He says to him he is just going to be gone for 4 years and asks Ron to stay with his sister during that time. He then says that after that, Ron could live his life. A life of not always hiding behind Jack and finding out what he wanted to do himself. Ron asks why he will be gone for 4 years, so Jack says it's so that he could protect his sister in 4 years. Ron asks Jack who he would be protecting his sister from. But before Jack can speak, he is interrupted by someone calling out to him. Jack feels frustrated that someone interfered with an important moment and asks them to come in. The page shows up and says he would make a report like Jack had asked him to. He says the guard was given first aid and sent for treatment. He then says that the guard accidentally cut off his fingers while training and dropped his dagger, and that dropped dagger unfortunately stabbed his eye. He says the story was wrapped up by mentioning that Jack had seen this and run to the annex building. Jack says good work to the page. He then says that since he is the Marquis' dog, he would give him the leftover bones. Jack calls him a chick, to which the page says that his name is James. To this Jack says whatever and tells him that he wants to train with a sword and asks James to bring him one real sword and one wooden one. James says that errands are not his job. Jack thinks that James at least has the pride of a knight. Jack then says to James that he knows that he doesn't like him, so he would give him a chance to beat the shit out of him. James asks Jack if he is serious and Jack tells him to take a look at his hands. He asks him if hands like these have ever held a sword before. Jack motivates James by saying that he could beat the shit out of him however he wanted in a duel. James asks if Jack wants him to be his swordsmanship teacher. To this, Jack says it's the most hilarious thing he's ever heard. Ron asks Jack if he would be okay since James is a 4th circle user, and Jack asks if Ron wants to make a bet with him regarding whether he could beat James or not. Ron says that rather than betting on who would win, they should wage on how many hits Jack would receive. Jack says this would be fun and asks Ron what he wants to bet. Ron says James is on an entirely different level than Phelan and asks Jack if he really wants to do this. To this, Jack says that Ron has no faith in him. So, Jack says that if he got hit even once during the duel, Ron would be considered the winner of the bet. Ron is shocked to hear this and Jack says that the loser would grant the winner's wish. Ron says that if there was something Jack wanted from him, all he had to do was give him an order as he's the manor's servant after all. Jack thinks that Ron saying this makes him want to tease him even more. Jack tells him again that he and Elizabeth are the only ones he trusts, and he would never order someone he trusts. Instead, he would only request them. So he asks Ron to let him request something. Ron says it's hard for him to refuse when he says it like that. James shows up again and after getting down on one knee, He apologizes to Jack for his rudeness earlier, and says that if he needs a sparring partner, then he would gladly be his partner and asks him to reconsider what he said earlier. Jack thinks there's plenty of people like that guard who disrespect him straight to his face, but indirect humiliation and laying a hand on him directly is completely different. So Jack realizes James must be afraid of what may come afterwards, which is why he was kneeling and saying this. Jack asks him if he wants to go somewhere no one could see them. Watching him sweat, Jack asks James if he is afraid of losing to him. James denies this and Jack says then he must be confident that he could beat the shit out of him. James doesn't reply, but Jack knows that's obvious that he thinks he can beat him because his face says it all. Jack asks Ron if there is a place where they can train and remain unseen. Soon, the three of them are in a room in the basement. Jack asks Ron if this is where he worked out. Ron says that this is the place that Jack's mother, Lady Noah, made for her children. Jack asks Ron why he didn't know about this place and Ron says it because he doesn't work out. Jack notices that there's not a speck of dust in the room despite it not being used, so he assumes that someone might be cleaning it periodically. Jack thanks Ron for cleaning the place and asks Ron to stop staring and hand over the wooden sword. James says that Jack is quite adept at holding the sword. Jack chuckles and thinks how if he piled up the humans and other species he's killed in his past life, it would reach the heavens. He thanks him for the compliment and lunges at him with the sword, but James blocks him easily. James thinks to himself that Jack is a novice and he was able to block the attack with ease. He decides to just scare him a bit and then let him win because he's afraid of the aftermath. Suddenly, Jack points his sword to James' throat and says that he would be dead now if this was a real sword. Jack says that he told him to take this seriously. James then wonders where he learned to move like this and if it's actually his first time holding a sword. Ron is shocked at what he witnessed. Jack had gone in for a thrust and James had smacked it aside. Even if he had just smacked it lightly, there's no way that it would have felt light to Jack. According to Ron's expectations, it should have ended with James beating Jack. But instead, what happened was perfect movements, perfect attacks and evasions from Jack. Ron is sure that if Jack was holding a real sword, James would have died. Ron is confused as to what happened to Jack, as he never held a sword before, let alone no swordsmanship. Ron wonders if this is what people called a genius and then corrects himself by saying that not even a genius would be this skilled. Jack then asks James if he's in his 20s. James says he's 23. Jack asks him when he started training with Mana. James says he started when he was 18. Jack is amazed and says that he reached the 4th circle in 5 years. In his mind, Jack thinks that James has some useful talent considering how he started late. He presumes that James could reach the 7th or 8th circle and could even aim for the Night Order captain position in a noble family's Night Order. Jack then goes to pick up the real sword, while thinking how James's talent has been reduced to taking care of a child. He faces James and tells him he's starting to like him. James warns Jack that he would get hurt. Jack bursts out laughing and tells him that there's a small difference between conceit and confidence. He asks James to not think that what happened just now was a coincidence or sheer luck. James remains speechless and Jack calls him a chick and asks him to come at him this time. Feeling offended, James rushes towards Jack, but Jack blocks his attack and manages to knock his sword out of his hands. Jack holds the sword against his neck again and says that it looks like James has died twice today. James angrily asks how he just did that. Jack simply says that he just changed the direction of the sword the moment they clashed. Then James asks how he did so. Jack tells him this is what is called an advanced technique. Jack asks if he wants to see it again and James says okay, but that he would use a real sword too this time. Turning to Ron, Jack says that he won the bet and his wish is what he'd requested earlier about his sister. He asks Ron if he could do that and Ron says he would put his life on the line to make it happen. James shows up with a sword and says things will be different this time. Jack calls him a chick and says that's amusing. Jack even tells James that he would let him use mana and he would use it too. Using mana and his sword, Jack jumps up and aims for James, who attempts to block it, but the very next moment, Jack's sword is by his neck again and immediately, James falls back and crashes to the ground. Jack steps on him and asks if it's over already. James asks Jack if he's a 3rd circle as it's impossible for a 1st circle to have such power. Jack understands James's confusion as a mere 1st circle beat him. But it was actually quite simple. Instead of the usual means of distributing mana evenly across your whole body to increase overall physical capabilities, Jack had focused all the mana onto one region. He asks James if he wants to be an official knight. James asks him what else he could be if not a knight, and the reply from Jack is a hound. He wants James to be a loyal hound that only follows his orders. Jax tells James that this way, he'd be able to live a much more entertaining life than a knight would. So that is it for this video, guys. Hope you enjoyed it. So if you like the video, then hit that like button and leave a comment for the next part. Most important, subscribe and press the bell icon for notification. I will meet you in the new video. Till then, bye.